A jet hangs in the air above a Soviet carrier deck. 3 engines scream at full power. It is 1991, and this machine is about to do something no aircraft has done before: transition from a dead hover to supersonic flight. This is the Yakovlev Yak-141, NATO codename Freestyle, the world's first supersonic vertical takeoff fighter. It will set 12 world records, survive carrier trials, and then vanish, erased by the collapse of the empire that built it. But its ghost lives on, inside every F-35B flying today. The Soviet Navy had a problem that shaped 50 years of aircraft design. Their carriers had no catapults. American flat-tops use steam catapults to hurl fighters off the deck at 150 knots. Soviet carriers, the Kiev class, the Kuznetsov, relied on ski jump ramps or vertical takeoff. If you wanted to fly jets from a Soviet deck, those jets had to go straight up. The first answer was the Yak-38 Forger. It was a disaster. Maximum speed barely below Mach 1. Combat radius under 200 kilometers, roughly 120 miles. In hot weather, it could barely take off with weapons. The automatic ejection system fired so often that the aircraft earned a reputation for throwing its pilots out on the flight deck. The Soviet Navy lost roughly a third of every Forger built to accidents. It was, by nearly every measure, operationally useless. The numbers told the story. The Yak-38 carried a fraction of what a Harrier could lift. It flew a fraction of the distance, and it crashed at a rate that would have grounded any Western program. The Soviet Navy needed something fundamentally better. Yakovlev's answer was radical. The Yak-141 would not just hover, it would break the sound barrier. No VTOL aircraft had ever gone supersonic. The British Harrier topped out at Mach 0.87. Yakovlev was targeting Mach 1.7, nearly twice the speed.
The key was the engine. The Soyuz R-79 V-300 produced 34,000 pounds of thrust in afterburner, more raw power than most contemporary fighter engines, but its defining feature was the vectoring nozzle. It could rotate 95 degrees, pointing straight down for vertical takeoff, then swiveling rearward for conventional flight. 2 smaller Rybinsk RD-41 lift jets, mounted behind the cockpit, provided an additional 18,000 pounds of vertical thrust. In hover, the 3 engines together produced over 52,000 pounds, enough to hold 19 tons in the air. The performance gap was staggering. Where the Harrier was subsonic, the Yak-141 reached Mach 1.7. Where the Forger had a combat radius of 120 miles, the Yak-141 could reach over 300. It carried radar-guided missiles. It had a modern glass cockpit. For the first time, a VTOL fighter could do everything a conventional fighter could do. The first conventional flight came on March 9, 1987. The first hover followed in December 1989, and by mid-1990, the Yak-141 completed the most critical test of all: full transition from vertical hover to forward flight and back. The aircraft worked. All 3 engines, the nozzle rotation, the complex flight control system, it all worked. On April 13th, 1991, test pilot Andrei Sinitsyn climbed into prototype 48-2 and set 12 FAI world records in a single session. Time to climb. Altitude records in the VTOL category.
That summer, the two flying prototypes deployed to the carrier Admiral Gorshkov for sea trials. The aircraft performed vertical takeoffs and landings on the pitching deck. It worked in conditions that would have been impossible for the Forger. For the first time, the Soviet Navy had a carrier-based fighter that could genuinely fight. October 5, 1991. Sinitsyn brought prototype 48-2 down for a vertical landing on the Gorshkov's deck. The sink rate was too high. The landing gear collapsed on impact. The fuel tank ruptured. Fire engulfed the aircraft within seconds. Sinitsyn ejected and survived, but the prototype was destroyed. The second flying airframe, 48-3, was intact. The program could have continued. 2 months later, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. On December 25, 1991, the red flag came down over the Kremlin for the last time. Military funding collapsed overnight. The Yak-41 program, which needed years of further development and a production commitment, was finished. Not because it failed, because the country that built it no longer existed. What happened next changed Western aviation. Within months of the Soviet collapse, Lockheed approached Yakovlev with a cooperation agreement. The details remain partially classified, but the core transaction is well documented. Yakovlev shared design data on the three-bearing swivel nozzle, the rotating exhaust system that made the Yak-41 possible. Lockheed was deep in the Joint Strike Fighter competition. They needed a VTOL solution for the Marine Corps variant. The Yak-141's nozzle was the answer.
The resemblance between the Yak-141's vectoring nozzle and the F-35B's three-bearing swivel module is not a coincidence. The geometry, the rotation arc, the fundamental engineering principle, they trace a direct line from Yakovlev's design bureau in Moscow to Lockheed Martin's plant in Fort Worth. Lockheed has acknowledged the relationship, but downplays the extent of the transfer. The engineering community is less ambiguous. Today, every F-35B that lifts off a Marine Corps amphibious assault ship carries the DNA of a Soviet fighter that flew for 4 years and set 12 world records before its country disappeared. The Pratt & Whitney F-Time 19's three-bearing swivel nozzle is the direct descendant of the R-79's rotating exhaust. The concept of a separate lift fan augmented by a vectoring main nozzle, that architecture was proven on the deck of the Admiral Gorshkov 35 years ago. Prototype 48-3, the Yak-141 that never crashed, survives in a Russian aviation museum. It sits among rows of Cold War aircraft, most of them obsolete. But the Yak-141 is different. It was not made obsolete. It was abandoned. And then its most important idea was carried across an ocean and built into the most expensive weapons program in human history. Subscribe to BingoFuel for more on the aircraft that shaped modern air power.